Our previous lesson introduced us to the rise and fall of a medieval port town, and this port town that we discussed in that lesson was the port town of Surat on the Gujarat coast. Now let us travel to the southern part of India and find out another port town there. So the port town that we will be focusing on in this lesson is Masulipatnam. Masulipatnam or Machilipatnam is located on the Andhra coast in the southeastern part of the Indian subcontinent. Now this map shows you the location of Masulipatnam. This is Masulipatnam and it could be found in the present day state of Andhra Pradesh. Now you must be wondering about the terminology or the etymology of Masulipatnam. Now in Telugu, Masuli or Machli means fish and Patnam means city. So just by hearing the name of this port town, that is Masulipatnam, you can infer that fishing activities were and still are carried out in this port town. Now Masulipatnam rose to prominence under the rule of the Qutub Shahi rulers. The Qutub Shahi rulers were the rulers of the Golconda Sultanate. The area that is marked in pink on this map shows you the Golconda Sultanate, and the Qutub Shahi rulers were the rulers of the Golconda Sultanate, and during their rule Masulipatnam emerged as a major port town in medieval India. Now we also have to take into account the geographical location of Masulipatnam. Where is Masulipatnam located? From a broader perspective, we can see that it is located in the Indian state of or the modern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. But geographically speaking, if we zoom in on Masulipatnam, we can find out that it is located in the delta of the Krishna river. This is the Krishna river. The Krishna river or the delta of the Krishna river is a very fertile area, and this is Masulipatnam that is located in the delta of the Krishna river. Now Masulipatnam was a major port town, that is to say trade activities increased in Masulipatnam during the medieval period. Now you have to keep another point in mind, that items and goods that were produced in the Godavari delta were also traded in Masulipatnam. So Masulipatnam was a very strategical port town under the Golconda Sultanate. This is because this port town contributed to the economic prosperity of this Sultanate. This port town boosted the economy of this region. So Masulipatnam gained prominence during the 17th century. And how is it so? Owing to the intense trade activities that were carried out in this region, Masulipatnam emerged as a major port town. Now it is imperative on our part to find out which items and products were traded in this port town, because a port town necessarily means that trade activities were performed there. And by trade activities being performed at a place, we should find out the products, the items that were exported from this port town. So let us find out more about the products that were traded from Masulipatnam. Masulipatnam, as we just mentioned, was a major and very important commercial center on the southeastern part of the Indian subcontinent. Now this was a hub or a center of trading activities, and few of the products that were exported from this port town were diamonds, rice, skins and spices. In our previous lesson, we discussed at great length that during the medieval period, India was a leading exporter of textiles and spices. Now, when we come to discussing textiles that were produced in medieval India, we have to take into account the various types of textiles or the variations of textiles that were prevalent in different states. Now when we were talking about Gujarat, we found out about the Bandhani and the Zari textiles. These were native to Gujarat. Now when we are coming to Masulipatnam, we should also take into account the textiles that were produced in Masulipatnam. Now of the various kinds of textiles that were produced in Masulipatnam, one textile type was and still continues to be very popular across the world. Can you name that textile type? It is known as kalamkari. So this kalamkari textile is native to Masulipatnam, which means that the kalamkari textile originated from Masulipatnam. Now when we talk about kalamkari textile, you must be very intrigued to know about the process of making this textile. Well, kalamkari is a type of block dye textile where only natural dyes are used. Now how is kalamkari made? On a piece of cloth, a kalam, which means a pen, is used, and in this pen natural dyes are filled. And with that pen, the natural dyes are painted onto the cloth. Can you imagine how much hard work must be required on the part of the artisans to produce such beautiful and intricate designs? Kalamkari textile is very popular in not just the Indian subcontinent but across the world, and its beauty, its intricacy speaks to this. But when we talk about kalamkari textile, you have to keep a very important point in mind. Previously, during the medieval period, kalamkari textile was mostly used for religious purposes. During this time, kalamkari textile was used on flags, temple hangings, banners and various pieces of cloth that presented the stories from Hindu epics. But in today's world, you can find kalamkari textiles on beautiful sarees. Now whenever the artisans were producing this kalamkari textile with so much labor and hard work, they also needed to ensure that their products were sold somewhere. Now where was kalamkari textile sold? This type of textile had steady markets in West Asia and Europe. So West Asia and Europe were the places where kalamkari textile was the most famous during the medieval period, and it is Masulipatnam, or this port town of Masulipatnam, that can be considered the fountainhead or the place of origin of kalamkari textile. We have been discussing how important Masulipatnam was as a port town in medieval India. It is from this port town of Masulipatnam that different kinds of items like diamond, chains or even textiles were exported, as a result of which many Britishers were coming to this port town. What happened because of this was the establishment of the first British settlement. So the earliest British settlement in the Indian subcontinent was at Masulipatnam. Now whenever a settlement grows somewhere, many kinds of things happen. One such thing is cultural exchange. Because Britishers were coming to stay here, they were interacting with the native masses, and as a result of this, culture was flowing both ways. There were interactions, there were cultural exchanges between these people. Seeing this as a very glorious opportunity, other European trading companies were also starting to flock at Masulipatnam. And an obvious continuation of this was that the Dutch set up their first factory here in Masulipatnam in 1605, and they were followed by the French in 1669. So now Masulipatnam was not just restricted to being a port town in medieval India, but new factories by the Dutch and French were being set up in Masulipatnam. And in these factories, raw materials which were obtained from the subcontinent itself were used to produce finished products which were then exported to the European countries. So this is how Masulipatnam has been a very important site in the pages of history. Now before finding out more about the interesting history of Masulipatnam, let me ask you a question quickly. Who were the first European settlers to set up their factory in Masulipatnam? Were it the Portuguese, the English, the French or the Dutch? Well, the correct answer is the Dutch. The Dutch were the first European settlers to establish their factory in Masulipatnam in the year 1605. A point we raised in the beginning of the lesson is that Masulipatnam rose to prominence under the Qutub Shahi rulers of the Golconda Sultanate. Now for this you have to gain a clearer understanding of the position of the Golconda Sultanate and the rulers of the Qutub Shahi dynasty vis-a-vis the East India companies. Now when the East India companies were coming to settle in Masulipatnam and set up their factories there, the rulers of the Qutub Shahi dynasty found a threat in this. How is it so? Because the rulers knew that if the English set up their factories there, trade or the control over trade would pass into their hands. This would mean that the Qutub Shahi rulers of the Golconda Sultanate would no longer enjoy control over, autonomy over trade in this region. Now the Qutub Shahi rulers were not willing to let trade pass into the hand of the English and the other East India companies. Now what did they do? They had to devise a strategy to prevent trade from passing into the hands of the East India companies. Now what was the idea they came up with? The local Qutub Shahi rulers now imposed royal monopolies. Now this brings us to a discussion on monopoly. What is a monopoly? A monopoly is a market with one seller and many buyers. So there is just one seller in a market who gets to sell one or many items, and there are multiple buyers who buy those items from that one seller. Now this concept of a monopoly might not be very clear to you. So allow me to explain this to you with the help of an example. Suppose you go to the market to buy cookies of your favorite brand. And upon going to the market, you find out that only one shop will sell that particular cookie. That is to say, you will not find that cookie in different shops. So only the seller or that one shop will be able to sell you that cookie, and you will be compelled to go to that particular shop to get your cookie. Now this is called a monopoly. So you, along with many other buyers, will be compelled to go to that one seller to buy that particular brand of cookie. So in that way, that seller or that shop is enjoying a monopoly on the sale of that cookie. A similar kind of thing happened when the Qutub Shahi rulers imposed royal monopolies. Now on the sale of which products did they impose royal monopolies? They did so on the sale of textiles and spices and different other items. Now textiles and spices constituted the most important products that were sold or exported from the Indian subcontinent. And now when the Qutub Shahi rulers of Golconda imposed royal monopolies on the sale of these items, this means that only a particular trader or only a group of particular traders were allowed to sell these products. Now why did they do so? The main reason behind the implementation of this strategy was to prevent trade from passing into the hands of the English and the other East India companies, because the Qutub Shahi rulers knew that they would not be able to compete against the East India companies, which is why they now imposed royal monopolies. Now what was the obvious repercussion of this imposition of royal monopolies? Because of this imposition, now various trading communities were involved and engaged in stiff competition. Trading communities in the likes of the Golconda nobles, the Telugu Komati Chettis, the Persian merchants, along with the European traders. Now all these trading communities were trying to defeat each other and gain control of Masulipatnam, and by gaining control of Masulipatnam, they would be able to make huge economic profit, huge financial profits. Because around this time, Masulipatnam was a major port town from where different kinds of items were exported. And the control of Masulipatnam would invariably mean economic prosperity and growth, which is why all these trading communities were trying to gain control of Masulipatnam. As a result of this competition, Masulipatnam was also emerging as a very important and a very strategic port town. This is because Masulipatnam now became a center point or a focal point of trade activities in this entire region. Which is why now various forms of architectures like sarais or rest houses, Innumerable pleasure parks and gardens and various other kinds of buildings were now being built in Masulipatnam. And this in a way meant that traders and merchants from different regions were attracted to Masulipatnam. Traders and merchants from different regions were now coming to settle in Masulipatnam. And eventually this made the city more populous and prosperous. Populous in the sense that more and more people were now coming to settle in Masulipatnam, which is why there was a surge in the population of merchants in Masulipatnam. And the more trade activities happen somewhere, the more would be economic prosperity. So all these together made Masulipatnam populous and prosperous. And this was happening around the 15th and the 16th centuries. Now by this time, Masulipatnam had emerged as a very important trading center in the dominion of Golconda. Now during this time, it was Emperor Aurangzeb who was ruling the Mughal Empire. Now when Aurangzeb saw that so many settlers were coming to settle in Masulipatnam or Golconda as a whole, Golconda was also gaining economic prosperity. Now this prospect of economic prosperity also became very enticing to Aurangzeb, which is why the Mughals now began eyeing Golconda. To put it simply, the Mughals were now trying to gain control of Golconda. But the control of Golconda did not come to the hands of the Mughals very easily. For this, Aurangzeb now devised a strategy. Let us find out what this strategy was and how this was implemented. Now around this time it was Mir Jumla, as you can see here, who was the Mughals representative. Along with being the Mughals representative and a governor in the Mughal Empire, Mir Jumla himself was also a merchant. Now what was the plan that Mir Jumla implemented? He now tried to pit the Dutch and the English against each other. So by putting the Dutch and the English in loggerheads with each other, you must be thinking that Mir Jumla or the Mughals as a whole were helping the Golcondas. But you will be wrong to think so, because the Mughals had a different plan in mind. While the Mughals pitted the Dutch and the English against each other, they had no intention of leaving Golconda with the Qutub Shahi dynasty itself. Now what was the outcome of Mir Jumla pitting the Dutch and the English East India companies against each other? This was now followed by the siege of Golconda that happened in the January of 1687. Now how was the siege of Golconda implemented? Through the siege of Golconda, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb along with his troops now marched into the region of the Qutub Shahi dynasty and invaded the Golconda fort. So this brought an end to the Qutub Shahi dynasty, and while Aurangzeb went on his annexation of regions in the south, along with capturing Golconda, he also captured Ahmednagar and Bijapur. On this map you can locate Ahmednagar and Bijapur. So together with Ahmednagar and Bijapur, Golconda were sieged by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. So this brought an end to the Qutub Shahi dynasty, or this brought an end to the Golconda Sultanate as a whole. And with this, the power of this region now passed into the hands of the Mughal Empire. Now the end of the Golconda Sultanate or the end of the Qutub Shahi dynasty also invariably meant the end of Masulipatnam, because Masulipatnam gained prominence, Masulipatnam gained importance during the rule of the Qutub Shahi rulers. And the defeat of the Qutub Shahi rulers also meant the defeat and the decline of Masulipatnam. Now this was one of the major reasons that contributed to the decline of Masulipatnam. Now let us find out more about how this major port town, this very important trading center in medieval India, met its decline. The point that we will now have to take into account is the rise of new cities. Now try to understand this very clearly. It's very simple. We have talked about how the Qutub Shahi rulers imposed royal monopolies on the sale of textiles and spices in Masulipatnam. Now after this, stiff competition happened among various trading communities. Now the European traders realized that Masulipatnam was not of any use to them because Masulipatnam was already a hotbed of contention. So many trading communities were already fighting amongst themselves to gain control of trade in Masulipatnam, which is why the European powers, the European traders now thought of giving up Masulipatnam and moving to different places. Now when they thought of leaving behind Masulipatnam to move to new places in the 18th century, this was followed by the rise of new cities in the likes of Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. On this map of India, you can locate Bombay, Madras and Calcutta. Bombay, Madras and Calcutta were now being given importance by the East India companies. They were leaving no stones unturned in developing these three cities. So the development of these new cities also meant the end of Masulipatnam. Now let us find out more about how the development of these new cities in the 18th century meant an end to the medieval port city of Masulipatnam. The emergence of these new cities now necessitated that the company traders along with the native traders now move from Masulipatnam to Bombay, Calcutta and Madras, because these now became the centers of trading activities. Masulipatnam was no longer important to the merchants and traders. So this led to the final decline of Masulipatnam in the 18th century. So what are the reasons that contributed to the decline of Masulipatnam? The first and the most important reason was the fall of the Qutub Shahi dynasty and the oncoming of the Mughal Empire. Because it was the Qutub Shahi dynasty that gave importance to Masulipatnam, and its defeat also inevitably meant the decline of this port town. Along with that, now traders relocated from Masulipatnam to these new cities. So traders were no longer stationed in Masulipatnam. Masulipatnam now started losing its importance. It started losing all its trading activities. Now if you have the previous lesson in mind, you will understand how the establishment of these new cities together contributed to the decline of medieval cities like Masulipatnam, and not just Masulipatnam but Surat as well. Because when we were discussing the rise and fall of Surat, we saw how the establishment of the East India companies meant that the traders and merchants from these medieval port cities were now moving to these new cities. These new cities now opened up greater prospects of trade. So why would the traders and merchants now keep themselves restricted to cities that were prevalent or that were prominent previously? Which is why Surat, Masulipatnam now started falling out of glory. These places now started falling out of importance. So Masulipatnam today lies in the pages of history as only a ruined and dilapidated little town. With this, we have successfully traced the trajectory of the growth and decline of a major port city in medieval India, that was Masulipatnam. Masulipatnam, as you must remember, is located in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, and it is in the southeastern part of the Indian subcontinent. Now Masulipatnam gained importance under the Qutub Shahi rulers, and it was the defeat of the Qutub Shahi rulers that also meant a defeat and an end to the glory of Masulipatnam. So with this, we come to an end of our discussion on medieval port towns as in Surat and Masulipatnam. In our subsequent lesson, we will now try to understand how these various East India companies were settling in the Indian subcontinent around this time and what were the outcomes of that. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.